be me, Greg, 33 sound engineer at a recording studio. Not some huge label place, just a solid mid-sized studio where bands and solo artists come to record. Been doing this for about 8 years. Now, love it, genuinely love it. There's something about sitting behind the board, adjusting levels, getting a mix just right, the kind of job where you can disappear into the work for hours and not even notice. Married to my wife for 4 years. At this point, met her when she was 26 and I was 28. She was working at a non-profit back then, some community outreach thing, sweet, funny, had opinions but wasn't aggressive about them. We clicked fast, moved in together after about a year, got married a year after that. First 2 years of marriage were solid. We had our arguments like any couple, but nothing crazy. She'd vent about work. I'd listen. I'd come home tired from a long session. She'd let me decompress normal stuff. Things started shifting somewhere around year 3, hard to pinpoint exactly when it began. She changed jobs, moved to a different nonprofit. This one was more focused on what she called social justice initiatives. New office, new coworkers, new energy. Suddenly, every conversation had vocabulary I'd never heard her use before. Words like emotional labor and toxic masculinity and microaggressions started showing up at the dinner table. At first, I didn't think much of it. People pick up language from their work environment. That's normal. But it wasn't just language. Her whole attitude started changing. She got into these podcasts, all about modern feminism and dismantling patriarchal structures. Every night she'd have earbuds in. Listening to some episode about how men are socialized to dominate, she'd pause them sometimes to tell me about whatever point they were making. Once she stopped mid-episode to inform me that the way I loaded the dishwasher was actually a form of learned helplessness designed to make her redo it. I just load the dishwasher the way I've always loaded it. Apparently that was political. Now started buying books too. Our bookshelf went from random novels and cookbooks to titles about male privilege and gender dynamics. Again, I figured it was a phase. Everyone goes through phases where they get really into something. Maybe she'd mellow out. After a while, she did not mellow out. The new coworkers became her new friend group. One in particular became her closest friend. This woman was intense every time she came over. The conversation turned into a seminar about everything wrong with men. I'd be sitting right there and they'd talk about how men are conditioned to be emotionally unavailable, or how men weaponize silence, or how the patriarchy has made it impossible for women to have equal partnerships. I'd just sit there eating my food, not saying anything because, what do you even say to that? If I agreed, it felt dishonest. If I disagreed, I was proving their points, so I just kind of existed in the room and waited for the topic to change. It never did. My wife started applying all this stuff directly to our relationship. Little comments at first. Like, if I forgot to text her back within an hour, she'd say I was demonstrating that her time wasn't valuable to me. Or if I sighed during an argument, she'd say I was using nonverbal cues to dismiss her emotions. I remember one night she asked me what I thought about some article. She'd read something about how men use logic as a weapon against women's feelings. I said I thought it was a bit extreme. She stared at me like I'd insulted her. Entire worldview. Told me I was displaying exactly the kind of defensiveness the article was describing, so I dropped it. Learned pretty quickly that disagreeing wasn't really an option anymore. Then came the list. I got home from the studio one evening, later than usual because we'd been working on this album that was behind schedule. She was sitting at the kitchen table with a piece of paper in front of her, told me to sit down because we needed to talk about our communication dynamics. Her exact words. She slid the paper across the table. It had a title at the top, Boundaries for Healthy Communication. Underneath were rules, actual numbered rules for how I was allowed to speak to her. Rule 1. Don't interrupt her, ever, even if there is a pause in her sentence, because women are socialized to pause, and men are socialized to fill those pauses as a dominance tactic. Rule 2. Never say calm down or relax, because that's gaslighting rule. 3. Don't explain things to her that she didn't ask to have explained, because that's mansplaining rule 4. Don't raise my voice for any reason. Any volume increase is aggression. Rule 5. Don't change the subject when she's expressing her feelings, because that's deflection, and it invalidates her emotional experience. I sat there reading this list, and I felt something heavy settle in my chest. Not anger, exactly. More like confusion, mixed with sadness. This was my wife, the woman I'd married, built a life with, and she'd written up a contract for how I was allowed to talk. But I looked at the rules individually and thought, okay, some of these aren't unreasonable on their own. Don't interrupt, don't yell, don't dismiss feelings. Those are basic respect things. So maybe she had a point. Maybe I'd been doing some of this stuff without realizing it. I told her I'd try. She seemed satisfied, gave me this look like a teacher who'd finally gotten a difficult student to behave. The look should have told me everything I needed to know, but I ignored it. The first couple of weeks weren't terrible. I was more conscious of how I spoke, caught myself a few times about to jump in while she was talking, and held back, made an effort to just listen when she vented about work instead of offering solutions. It felt a little unnatural, but I figured I was adjusting. The problem was that the rules only applied to me. She interrupted me constantly, middle of my sentence. She'd just start talking over me like I wasn't even speaking, and when she got frustrated, her voice went up plenty. Not just a little, full-on yelling. Sometimes one night, I pointed this out very calmly, very carefully said something like, "Hey, I've been really working on the communication stuff, but I notice you still interrupt me and raise your voice sometimes, and I'm wondering if maybe we could both work on it?" She looked at me like I'd said something absurd, told me it wasn't the same thing when she interrupted. It was because she was passionate and engaged in the conversation. When I interrupted, it was a power move rooted in male socialization. When she raised her voice, she was expressing legitimate emotion. When I raised mine, it was intimidation, same behavior, completely different interpretations depending on who was doing it. I opened my mouth to respond, but honestly, I didn't even know where to start with that logic, so I just nodded and let it go. The list kept growing every few days. She'd add something new, couldn't say, "I'm tired too," when she complained about her day, because that was minimizing her experience. Couldn't offer solutions to her problems, just had to listen and validate, couldn't make jokes about feminism. Even lighthearted ones couldn't use sarcasm, because it was passive aggression, couldn't bring up anything about my own day until she was done talking about hers, because centering my experience was derailing. Couldn't use certain phrases like, "That's not what I meant," because that was tone policing in reverse, or something I lost track of the reasoning behind half of them. Every rule had some academic-sounding justification. She'd quote a podcast or reference some book, and I'd just nod, because arguing about any individual rule would trigger 3 more rules about how I was arguing wrong. Her friend came over for dinner one night. I was cooking, which I usually did because I actually enjoy it. They were at the table talking. At some point, I said something. Can't even remember what it was. Probably just a casual comment about the food or something. My wife cut in and corrected me in front of her friend, said we'd agreed that I wouldn't phrase things that way. Her friend nodded approvingly and said something about how great it was that my wife was training me to be more mindful, training me like I was a dog, learning not to bark. I didn't respond, finished cooking, put the food on the table, ate my portion, then said I had to check on something in the other room. Sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the wall for about 20 minutes. Didn't feel angry, felt tired, just deeply, profoundly tired. There was this heaviness in my chest that wouldn't go away. Every conversation at home had become a minefield. I'd think about what I wanted to say, then run it through the filter of all the rules, then try to figure out if any of them applied, then decide if it was worth the risk of getting corrected. Most of the time, the answer was no. It wasn't worth it. started keeping things to myself, she'd ask how my day was, and I'd say fine. She'd ask what I thought about something, and I'd say, sounds good. Shorter answers, felt safer, less chance of stepping on a rule. I'd forgotten about. Then came the conversation that changed everything. I was at the studio working on a mix. One of the other engineers, a guy I'd worked with for years, noticed I was off, asked if everything was okay. I don't usually talk about personal stuff at work, but something made me open up a little. Told him, the basics. Wife has all these rules about how I can talk. Anything I say gets analyzed and corrected. Feel like I'm walking on eggshells at home. He listened, didn't say much while I was talking. Then, when I was done, he just looked at me and said one thing. Man, if everything you say is wrong, why say anything at all? He didn't mean it as advice really, more like an observation, but it hit me like something clicked into place. He was right. If every sentence I spoke at home was subject to review, and most of them failed the test, then the logical move was to stop producing sentences, not out of spite, not as a tactic, just pure self-preservation. Why put your hand on a stove that burns you every time you just stop touching it? Went home that night. My wife was in the kitchen, started telling me about some conflict at her office, how one of the male board members had been dismissive during a meeting. Normally I would have engaged, asked questions, maybe offered a thought. Instead, I just listened when she paused and looked at me for a response. I said, "That sounds rough." Nothing else. She waited for more. There was no more. I loaded the dishwasher and went to the living room next day. Same pattern. She talked. I gave short acknowledgments, yeah, and okay, and got it, and makes sense. No opinions, no questions, no jokes, no stories about my own day. Just the minimum words needed to not be rude. I wasn't doing it to punish her genuinely. It was more like a reflex that had developed. Speaking had become associated with correction and conflict. Silence was the only safe zone. So I lived in it. The first week went by, and honestly, I think she enjoyed it. Probably thought her communication rules had finally kicked in. Her husband was quiet, attentive. Not saying anything problematic. Mission accomplished the second week. She started to notice something was off. I wasn't asking about her day anymore. Wasn't commenting on dinner. Wasn't suggesting we watch something together or go anywhere on the weekend. Wasn't laughing at her stories. Wasn't initiating any kind of conversation at all. She'd walk into the room and I'd acknowledge her with a nod and go back to whatever I was doing. Not cold. Exactly, just neutral, like a polite roommate you don't know very well. She started testing it, asked me what I wanted to do that weekend, whatever works for you. Asked my opinion on repainting the bedroom, your call. Asked if something was wrong, no, I'm good. Every answer was technically fine, polite, cooperative, agreeable, and completely empty. By the third week. She was getting agitated, I could see it. She'd say something clearly designed to provoke a reaction, make a comment about how the studio must be more important to me than my marriage. Normally, that would have stung, and I would have defended myself. Instead, I just looked at her and said, "I'm sorry you feel that way." Then went back to reading. She tried picking fights, would bring up old arguments, things from years ago that we'd already resolved, brought up the time I forgot her birthday dinner reservation 2 years ago, brought up some comment I made about her mother once that she said was dismissive, dragged out every archived grievance she had stored away. I'd listen until she was done and say, okay, nothing else, no defense, no counterattack, no emotion, just okay. It was driving her insane. One night, I heard her on the phone with her friend in the other room. She was crying, saying I'd become like a wall, that I was punishing her with silence, that she felt more alone with me in the house than she would if I were gone. Her friend was telling her this was textbook emotional abuse, that withholding communication is a control tactic, that I was deliberately depriving her of connection to establish dominance. I heard all of this and felt almost nothing. A few months ago, it would have gutted me to hear my wife crying about our relationship. Now it was just noise. Something had shifted inside me that I couldn't shift back. The caring part of me had been corrected and policed and rewritten so many times that it just went quiet. Not with a bang, more like a light dimming until you don't notice. When it goes all the way out, the confrontation came a few days later. I got home from work, and she was sitting in the living room, clearly waiting for me. No TV on, no phone, just sitting there. She told me to sit down, said what I was doing was a form of abuse, that my silence was worse than if I were yelling at her, that I was intentionally withholding emotional intimacy to control her, that she'd been reading about it, and it's called stonewalling, and it's recognized as a type of domestic violence. She was dead serious. There were tears in her eyes, but her voice was hard. She'd rehearsed this. I let her finish. Didn't interrupt. Because that's still against the rules. When she was done, I took a second and then said something I'd been thinking for weeks, but never planned to say out loud. Told her she made the rules about how I could speak. Told her I followed every single one. Told her the safest way to never break any of them was to not speak much at all. Said I wasn't withholding anything, was just operating within the system. She designed, she exploded, said I was twisting everything around, said I was a manipulator, said I'd found a loophole to torment her, and I was using it deliberately, said I was worse than men who yell. Because at least with yelling, you know where you stand, I just sat there and took it when she was done. I said, okay, and stood up, grabbed a blanket and a pillow from the closet, slept on the couch that night. Actually slept pretty well better than I had in weeks, lying there in the dark, quiet living room, nobody analyzing my breathing pattern for signs of emotional unavailability, just silence real. Peaceful silence. Woke up the next morning before her made coffee, drank it standing in the kitchen, looking out the window. She came out eventually, eyes puffy, clearly hadn't slept well. Stood in the doorway for a minute, like she wanted to say something. I rinsed my mug, said, heading to work early, and left, didn't kiss her goodbye. Used to always kiss her goodbye, hadn't even thought about it. Until I was already in the car. Realized I didn't feel bad about it either, just felt like a thing that used to happen and didn't. Anymore, over the next few days, something shifted again. Not in the relationship. That was already gone, even if neither of us had admitted it. Yet the shift was in me. I started noticing how different I felt at the studio versus at home at work. I talked normally, cracked jokes with the other engineers, gave feedback to artists, sometimes blunt feedback, and they appreciated it because the job requires honesty, laughed, argued about music, debated whether analog warmth was real or just nostalgia. Normal human interaction. Then I'd drive home and feel my chest tighten as I got closer to our street. By the time I pulled into the driveway, my jaw was clenched. Walking through the front door felt like entering a courtroom where everything I said would be used against me, so I started staying late at the studio, not because of some other woman or anything dramatic like that, just because the studio was the one place where talking didn't come with consequences. I could say what I thought without someone pulling out a rule book. Started eating dinner at this place near the studio. 2 little burger spot that stayed open late. Sat at the counter by myself. Ate in peace. Scrolled my phone. Nobody asking me to justify my word choices over a plate of food. Sometimes one of the other engineers would join me, and we'd just talk about normal stuff, music, gear. Some artist who was being difficult in the booth conversations that didn't require a compliance checklist felt like breathing after being underwater. My wife noticed the late nights, accused me of avoiding her. Technically, she was right, but I didn't confirm or deny, just said, we had a big project with a tight deadline. She asked if there was someone else. I said no. She didn't believe me, but couldn't prove otherwise because there was nothing to prove. The truth was simpler and sadder than an affair. I just didn't want to come home around this time. She tried a new approach, came to me one evening, and said forget. The list said she was willing to drop all the rules. if I would just talk to her, like I used to. Like things were before, and I could see she meant it in that moment. She looked scared, vulnerable in a way I hadn't seen from her in a long time. There was a part of me deep down that wanted to respond to that, a part that remembered why I married her, but the bigger part of me, the part that had been conditioned over months of walking on eggshells, that part just looked at her and said, I am talking to you normally. Because, from my side, this was normal. Now, this was what she'd shaped. You spend months telling someone that every natural instinct they have in conversation is wrong or harmful or abusive, and eventually they believe you. Eventually the instinct dies, you don't get to kill something and then be upset when it's dead. She started crying, said she didn't recognize me anymore, said I used to be warm and funny and engaged, said she missed who I was. I almost said, I miss who you were too. But I caught myself, not because of any rule, just because I didn't see the point. We were past the point where words could fix anything she'd spent so long controlling what I said, that when she finally gave me permission to speak freely, I had nothing left to say. A couple more weeks went by like this cold. Quiet coexistence, two people in the same house, living completely separate lives. She'd try to start conversations, and I'd respond with just enough to not be rude. She'd suggest date nights or therapy, and I'd say maybe, or I'll think about it. Never committed to anything, never refused anything, just existed in this gray zone where nothing could reach me. Then, one evening, I came home and said, it didn't plan a speech, didn't sit her down for a talk, just walked in, set my bag down, and told her I'd filed for divorce, told her the papers were with my lawyer, and she'd be getting her copies soon. Her face went through about 5 emotions in 3 seconds. Confusion, disbelief, anger, panic, and then this deep, raw hurt that almost got to me. Almost. She asked if this was a joke. I said no. She asked how I could do this without even trying to work things out. I told her I'd been trying for over a year, tried following her rules, tried being what she wanted, tried adjusting every part of how I communicated, did everything she asked, and it still wasn't enough. Then, when I finally gave her exactly what the rules demanded, which was essentially silence, that wasn't enough either. There was no version of me she'd accept. The man who talked was wrong, and the man who didn't talk was wrong. So the only option left was a man who wasn't there at all. She started bargaining, said we could go to couples therapy, said she'd delete the list, burn it, whatever I wanted, said she'd stop listening to the podcasts and distance herself from her friend, said she'd change. I told her I'd spent 4 years changing, and I was done. Those were pretty much the last real words I said to her as her husband. After that night, everything went through lawyers. She didn't take it well, kept calling my phone. Sometimes 5 or 6 times in a row, I never picked up texts, came flooding in 2 long paragraphs about how we could fix this, then angry messages about how I was abandoning her, then sad ones at 2 in the morning about how she couldn't sleep. I read a few of them early on, but stopped after a while. Nothing in them was going to change anything. She tried reaching out through mutual friends. Some of them called me to say she was a mess, and maybe I should talk to her. I told them I appreciated their concern, but all communication was going through my attorney. The mutual friends started picking sides. Most of them were originally her friends anyway, so they went with her. A couple of them sent me messages that were clearly drafted with her input, full of therapy language about accountability and emotional harm. One of them called me selfish for not even trying counseling. I didn't argue with any of them, just said thanks for reaching out and left it at that. A couple of the guys I knew from before the marriage reached out privately and said they understood, didn't make a big deal out of it, just said if I needed anything they were around. Those messages meant more than they probably knew. The divorce process itself was relatively straightforward, no kids, which made it simpler. The asset stuff took some negotiation, but nothing extreme. My lawyer handled everything, and I just signed where I needed to sign. During this whole process, she kept trying to create situations where we'd have to interact, wanted to discuss the division of stuff in person, instead of through lawyers, wanted to meet for coffee to talk like adults, wanted closure. She said I didn't give her any of it. Everything stayed through the attorneys after the papers were finalized. She showed up at the studio twice. Actually, first time I wasn't there. She waited for about an hour, according to the receptionist, and then left. Second time, I was walking out at the end of the day, and there she was, standing by the entrance. She looked like she hadn't slept in days. Red eyes, hair not done the way she usually kept it, wearing a jacket I'd given her a couple of years ago. Whether the jacket was deliberate or not, I don't know. She started talking, immediately said she just needed 5 minutes, said she needed to understand why, said she deserved that much. At least. I looked at her for a second, and then walked past her to my car. Didn't say a word, didn't speed up or slow down, just walked at a normal pace, got in, started the engine. She followed me to the car and stood outside the driver's side window, yelling now, asking if I felt nothing, asking if everything we had meant nothing. I put the car in reverse, pulled out of the spot, and drove away. Watched her shrink in the rearview mirror, standing in the parking lot with her arms at her sides, felt a small ache somewhere in my chest. But it passed by the time I hit the highway. A few weeks after the divorce was final, she posted on social media about it. One of the mutual friends told me about it, sent me a screenshot, even though I didn't ask long post about how her ex-husband had emotionally abused her through prolonged silent treatment, about how he'd weaponized her own communication boundaries against her, about how she was a survivor of covert narcissistic abuse. The comments were split. Half her friends left supportive messages about how brave she was, the other half, mostly people who actually knew both of us, were more measured. A few pointed out that she'd literally written rules dictating how her husband could speak, and then got upset when he stopped speaking. One comment said, "You told him every word was wrong, so he stopped using words. What did you think would happen?" She deleted that one pretty fast. I didn't engage with any of it, didn't post my side, didn't respond, didn't even look at the post myself. Beyond the screenshot, my side of the story wasn't anyone's business. And honestly, what would I even say? Everything that needed to be said was covered by the silence. She complained about the irony was never lost on me. She spent months trying to control my words, succeeded so completely that I ran out of them, then spent more months trying to get them back. And by then it was too late. You can't drain a well and then be surprised when it's dry. Life after the divorce was quiet. I mean that literally, my apartment was quiet. No podcasts playing in the background about toxic masculinity, no lists of approved vocabulary, no conversations that felt like performance reviews. Just silence. Good silence this time, the kind you choose, not the kind you're forced into. I started talking more at work, actually became more social with the other engineers, and the artists who came through the studio, went out for drinks after sessions, sometimes had conversations where I said exactly what I thought, without filtering it through. 20 rules. First felt like waking up from something, not all at once, but gradually, like circulation, coming back to a limb that had been pinned under something heavy. She tried reaching out a few more times over the following months. Birthday text. Got no reply email about some mail that came to our old address. I had my lawyer respond once she sent a long handwritten letter to the studio. My coworker put it on my desk. I looked at it, recognized her handwriting on the envelope, threw it in the trash without opening it. Not because I hated her. I didn't hate her. Hatred requires energy and engagement, and I had neither for her anymore. It was more like she was a chapter in a book I'd finished reading, going back to reread it. Wouldn't change the ending, last I heard. Through the grapevine, she'd softened on a lot of her views. Apparently the friend group that had encouraged all her feminist communication rules had mostly scattered some falling out about who was the most committed to the cause or something. The friend who'd called me trainable got into a relationship with some guy, and suddenly her politics evolved when she was on the receiving end of her own standards Funny how that works. My ex tried dating again from what I was told, couple of guys, but nothing stuck. Apparently she kept trying to establish communication frameworks early on, and they just walked away. One guy lasted 3 dates before he told her he wasn't interested in being managed. Another one apparently laughed when she brought out the rules and thought she was joking when he realized she wasn't. He paid the check and left, didn't stick around long enough to develop the kind of silence I gave her, just left at the first sign of a rules list. Smarter than me, I guess. Or maybe they just hadn't loved her enough to try, as long as I did not sure which. The thing that stays with me most isn't the anger or the rules, or even the divorce. It's that moment when she told me to forget the list and just talk to her normally, and I couldn't not. Because I was being stubborn. Because the part of me that talked freely to her was gone. She didn't kill it on purpose. Nobody sits down and thinks I'm going to systematically destroy my husband's willingness to communicate with me. But that's what happened. One correction at a time, one rule at a time, one disapproving look at a time, until the guy who used to come home and ramble about his day over dinner and laugh at his own bad jokes and argue about where to go for vacation, that guy just wasn't there anymore, replaced by someone who said okay and sounds good and your call. She built a cage for my words and then cried when the bird stopped singing. I don't have some big lesson to share or deep wisdom about relationships, don't have a manifesto about gender dynamics, or a hot take about feminism. All I know is what happened to me. Someone I loved decided that the way I naturally communicated was harmful, rewrote the rules until speaking felt dangerous, and then panicked when silence was all I had left. By the time she was ready to listen, it was too late. I was already done talking, and not just to her. To that version of myself too, the Greg who tried to make it work, no matter what. The one who'd swallow his pride and adjust and adapt and bend until he was shaped into something unrecognizable. That Greg is gone. The one who's here now doesn't have a list of rules on his fridge, doesn't rehearse sentences before saying them in his own home, doesn't feel his chest tighten when he pulls into his own driveway, just lives works, comes home to a quiet apartment where quiet is a choice and not a survival strategy. Got a decent place, not far from the studio. Nothing fancy. 1 bedroom. But it's mine. Set up a little home recording corner in the living room for personal projects, started working on some music of my own. For the first time in years, hadn't done that since before the marriage, used to mess around with production and composition back in my 20s. But let it slide. Now I've got the time and the headspace for it. Again, funny. What opens up when you're not spending all your mental energy monitoring your own speech? And that's enough. Honestly, it's more than enough. It's everything I didn't know I needed until I lost everything I thought I wanted. She wanted a man who would follow her rules. She got one, and it cost her a marriage. Sometimes. I wonder if she ever connected those dots. Probably not. The post she wrote made it pretty clear she still thinks I'm the villain. That's fine. I'm done explaining myself. She made sure of that.